Hello everyone, back at it again. Sorry for the month-long hiatus. I was like sick for a week and then recovering, and then I had my wisdom teeth removed and had to recover from that. But today we're gonna do a deck tech on Braids Cabal Minion. She is a mono black commander who lends herself towards a heavy stack style strategy. And Stax is basically the name originates from Smokestack, which is basically kind of the same card as Braids. Um, and it's a style of deck that basically wants to hinder your opponent's resources as much as possible and bring the game to kind of a grinding halt and just grind out resources until basically you're the last one standing because your deck is better prepared for the stacks game plan than your opponent's because you got to design your deck to do so. So Braids cost 2 black black. She's a legendary human minion creature and she's a 2/2. At the beginning of each player's upkeep, that player sacrifices an artifact, creature, or land. So, in building this deck, you kind of want to try to have as many ways as possible to make the braids effect as unsymmetric as possible. So, we'll talk about those cards as we get to them. First and foremost, we'll just start with the artifacts. We have Charcoal Diamond. It's a 2 mana accelerant to try to help you to turn 3 braids. There are a lot of mana rocks available at 2 CMC that you could like theoretically have like 10 of them or maybe even more. But this deck is heavily based on a friends list, and he was more interested in having mana rocks that produce black. That was the important part. So we aren't maxed out on mana rocks at 2 CMC. Um, we have Coercive Portal, which is kind of a weird card that doesn't really see play in many formats, mostly because it's a Will of the Council card, and uh, in in general, you have to be willing to play the card for uh, a very specific reason, generally for the uh, mode where the votes are tied. And in this case, it's at the beginning of your upkeep, starting with you. Each player votes for Carnage or Homage. If Carnage gets more votes, you sacrifice Coercive Portal and destroy all non-land permanents. If Homage gets more votes or it's tied, you draw a card. So this is kind of just basically a one-sided Howling Mine. You get to draw. You're basically always voting for Homage because even if you vote for Carnage and your opponent doesn't want Carnage to happen, they're going to be voting for Homage and you'll get the Homage effect anyway, which is draw a card. It's a very good card. Crucible of the Worlds. This is one of the best cards in the deck. First and foremost, it allows you to make braids non-symmetrical by sacrificing one of your own lands and then replaying it every single turn, whereas your opponent is not going to be able to do that. You also have some other sweet interactions with a Crucible, and we'll talk more about that when we get to the lands. Ensnaring Bridge, you can play this and then kind of play your hand out as fast as possible, make it to where your opponent cannot attack you, and then as you're grinding them out, when you finally get to the point where you want to kill them, you build up your board or whatever, you can just sacrifice the bridge to braids and then go for the kill. Ichor Wellspring, another card that helps with making braids as unsymmetrical as possible. You have, when it comes into play or dies, you draw a card, so you get a card on the way in, then you sacrifice it to braids. You're not really losing anything, and you get to draw a card, so you're really gaining something. Mind Stone is one of the colorless mana rocks that was considered good enough for the deck because it can cycle later on in the game if you really need it to. Mycosynth Wellspring, I think this is one of the best cards in the deck. It guarantees you your next land drop once you play it, and then you sacrifice it to Braids. You don't lose anything. You get another land that you can just feed to Braids even more. Pithing Needle lets you deal with problematic permanents like planeswalkers and such. And if it isn't good in the matchup or whatever, you can just sacrifice it to Braids. Relic is some graveyard hate for the deck. It cycles if you need it to, and it also has just the tiniest bit of synergy with the deck, and I'll show that off when we get to it. Servo Schematic is a new card, and it's just very, very similar to Ichor Wellspring and Mycosynth Wellspring in that it does something when it comes into play or is put into a graveyard, so you can sacrifice it to Braids and such. And the 1/1s, they aren't really all that relevant for the game plan, so you can also sack them. So this is kind of like 4 Braids triggers uh, that you can feed. Skull Clamp is one of the most broken cards in the deck. You just get to clamp the living crap out of certain cards in this deck, and it's just very, very good. Smokestack is another Stax effect if Braids is killed off too many times or anything like that, or if you just want to grind faster, you can play multiple of the Stax effects at once. Um, Basically, it says at the beginning of your upkeep, you may put a soot counter on Smokestack. At the beginning of each player's upkeep, that player sacrifices a permanent for each soot counter on Smokestack. So your opponent is going to be uh, the first person to sacrifice something of this. And to explain how this works, it's very similar to the next card we're about to talk about, Tangle Wire, where you can stack the triggers however you want. So you want to put at the beginning of your upkeep, you may put a soot counter on Smokestack on the stack first and then the sacrifice. So you'll sacrifice 0 permanents for the first time around. Then you'll put a soot counter on it. Your opponent will have to sacrifice a permanent, and you want to keep doing it that way. Um, I'm not really sure what an optimal number of soot counters is for this card. It could depend heavily on what your opponent is doing, but I have to imagine that you probably don't want to very often go more than 2. And then once you've determined that your opponent has been set far enough back to Smokestack, you can just sacrifice it to itself and cut your losses. Tangle Wire has Fading 4, and then at the beginning of each player's upkeep, that player taps an untapped artifact, creature, or land he or she controls for each fade counter on Tangle Wire. So you can stack this to put the tap ability on the stack, then the fading. So you fade down 1, so it'll be 3. Your opponent will have tapped 4. You'll only have to tap 3, and you can tap Tangle Wire to itself. So really, you only have to tap 2 other permanents. So it's just a really, really busted card that really can deny your opponent some mana. For instance, we have Dark Ritual. Turn 2 Braids is amazingly good. That's mostly what this card is in the deck for. Occasionally you'll Dark Ritual out a threat of some sort, but the card is just very good for that exact reason. Diabolic Edict just gives you an instant speed edict. Dismember is a cheap, flexible removal spell that can, later on in the game, if you have the mana available, you can spend the mana instead of the Phyrexian mana as life. Fatal Push is just a cheap um, removal spell. It's very easy to turn on Revolt in this deck. If Braids is in play, and then you can play it as a sorcery to kill a big creature. Go for the Throat is just an efficient 2-mana removal spell. Hero's Downfall gives you some Planeswalker interaction, kind of like Pithing Needle, Murderous Cut. You're going to have a pretty big graveyard in this deck very often, so Dell is readily available. Tribute to Hunger gives the deck some much needed life gain, and it's also removal. We'll talk about the creatures next. We have Abyssal Persecutor, 4 mana, 6/6 flying trample with the ability you can't win the game, your opponents can't lose the game. So you kind of just sail over with this guy and clock your opponent until they're dead, and then when you want to actually have them lose the game, you can sacrifice Abyssal Persecutor to Braids. It's pretty straightforward. For possibly the best card in the deck, Bloodghast. Bloodghast can't block. Bloodghast has haste as long as an opponent has 10 or less life, and landfall. Uh, when the land enters play under your control, you may return Bloodghast from your graveyard to the battlefield. So you're making land drops. You get to sacrifice Bloodghast to Braids to make the effect of Braids unsymmetrical. And also, you get to Skull Clamp the living crap out of this thing. And as you're Skull Clamping it, you're drawing more lands, which in turn brings back Bloodghast, which allows you to Skull Clamp it again. And eventually, you can just win the game with the thing. It is a very, very resilient creature. Dark Confidant is another card draw engine for the deck, and if you're in peril of dying to it, you can just sacrifice it to Braids. Worth noting that if you're going to die to it on your next upkeep, uh, that ability is going to go on the stack, so you're probably going to die to it if you're at a extremely low life total. So you want to be thinking about that and probably put the Braids trigger on the stack first, then the Dark Confidant, so you can get maximum amount of information about whether you need to keep it around or not. Another undercosted big flying creature, Desecration Demon. This one's probably worse than Abyssal Persecutor because if your opponent doesn't want it to attack desperately, they can feed a creature to it. And with a creature guaranteed being in the command zone every game, it can happen to where this guy just doesn't get to attack very often. Grave Titan, massive, gigantic threat that allows you to just close a game out super fast, can feed Stax effects with the zombies, just very, very powerful card. Hangerback Walker, pretty similar to a lot of the sort of Wellspring type cards. You can cast it for 2 mana and then just feed it to Braids twice, or you can level it up and stuff and make it bigger so you get more Thopters out of it. Nether Spirit is the neat interaction with Relic that I was talking about earlier. At the beginning of your upkeep, if Nether Spirit is the only creature card in your graveyard, you may return Nether Spirit to play. So you get to target yourself with Relic with the tap ability and exile a creature of your choice, and then that will allow Nether Spirit to be able to come back at your upkeep. You can also stack it to put. I guess you're never really going to be able to sack Nether Spirit, get it back immediately, but you can stack it to where Braids is on the stack first, then you put Nether Spirit, so Nether Spirit comes back, then you sack it to Braids, and you get to keep doing that at basically every upkeep. Nether Trader is kind of slow for its effect. It's pretty similar to Bloodghast in its function. It's a 1/1 haste with Shadow, so it can only block or be blocked by creatures with the ability Shadow. And whenever another creature is put into your graveyard from play, you may pay black if you do return Nether Trader from your graveyard to play. So if you're, sacrificing any sort of tokens and stuff, you can start bringing this guy back and having, more fodder to Braids. Ophiomancer, at the beginning of each upkeep, if you control no snakes, put a 1/1 black snake creature token with Death Touch onto the battlefield. This card is excellent. It's kind of just like a mini Bitter Blossom. You just get tokens to be able to sack to Braids over and over and over. Just very good. And then we have another big 6 mana card, Wormcoil Engine. Some much needed life gain for the deck. A resilient threat. It's big, kills fast. It's very nice. Planeswalkers, we have Liliana, who is going to be able to be some removal some percentage of the time, and also help with the Stax effect to where you're forcing your opponent to discard cards, and just very, very good. And with a lot of cards that, you don't honestly care that much if they're in the graveyard, sometimes that's good. In the case of Nether Trader, Nether Spirit, Bloodghast. If you have a Crucible out, discarding lands is great. It isn't honestly all that big of a detriment some amount of the time. And then a game-winning ultimate, obviously. But I doubt the ultimate will honestly be destroying that many permanents because Braids makes games low resource very fast. Obnixilis Reignited, 5 mana Planeswalker. +1, you draw a card, you lose 1 life. -3, destroy target creature. -8, target opponent gets an emblem with whenever a player draws a card, you lose 2 life. So game-winning ultimate, some removal on the minus, some card draw on the plus. This isn't a Planeswalker I would be looking forward to playing outside of basically mono black. or maybe some two-color black decks, because it honestly is not the most powerful planeswalker running around, and it is expensive for what you get, but it's an excellent role player and it does everything you want on a planeswalker. It's card advantage, it's removal, it's a game-winning ultimate. It's pretty straightforward. For sorceries, we have Beseech the Queen. It's a tutor equal to converted mana cost for number of lands you control. Often that's not going to be able to tutor for a ton of the most expensive cards in the deck, but it will let you get the cheap effects that make Braids unsymmetrical, like Bloodghast, Bitter Blossom, etc. So it's just another tutor for the deck. Black Sun Zenith is a Wrath that gets around indestructible and such. It's just generally a reasonable Wrath effect. Chainer's Edict, one in a black, sorcery, target player sacrifices a creature with flashback for 5 black black. You're not going to be able to flash this back super often, but sometimes Braids will just die a ton of times, and you will not be able to force the game into low resource count, and sometimes having the extra spell attached to this is very nice. Choking Sands is the first of many Stone Rain style effects. Again, you're just trying to force your opponent low on resources and then capitalize on that by just beating them down with whatever you have left over. And this is destroy target non-swamp. If that land was non-basic, you deal 2 damage to the land's controller. Damnation, 4 mana Wrath, pretty straightforward. Dark Petition, spell mastery is pretty easy to get. We have plenty of instants and sorceries, so this is basically Demonic Tutor and Dark Ritual attached to each other. Um, it's pretty straightforward. Tutor for whatever you want. Same with Demonic Tutor, just 2 mana, search for whatever you need. Duress is the first piece of hand disruption we have. We want to just trade 1 for 1 on resources very, very often, and then force the opponent into a situation where you're massively ahead on cards, and it's very trivial for you to win at that point. Him, classic 2 for 1 discard spell. Icequake is another Stone Rain, destroy target land. If that land was a snow land, Icequake deals 1 damage to that land's controller. Innocent Blood, single black, each player sacrifices a creature. This is a very, very good early play. It lets you deal with mana dorks and such, and you have plenty of dispensable creatures just lying around that you can sacrifice to it. Inquisition of Kozilek, cheap discard spell. It's very good. Myra's Toll, pretty similar. Target player reveals the number of cards from his or her hand equal to the number of swamps you control. You choose one, discard it. So at like 1 mana, it's just a Raven's Crime, or at 1 swamp, it's a Raven's Crime. At 2, and it scales the more swamps you have. Night's Whisper, 2 mana, draw 2, lose 2, just cheap card draw. Rain of Tears is another Stone Rain effect. Rancid Earth, another Stone Rain effect. This one has Threshold, deals 1 damage to each creature and each player. Read the Bones, scry 2, draw 2, lose 2. More cheap card draw. Sign in Blood, same thing. Draw 2, lose 2. Sinkhole, 2 mana, destroy target land. Smallpox is a really, really powerful card. Each player loses 1 life, discards a card, sacrifices a creature, sacrifices a land. On the play, if your opponent leads on turn 1 mana dork and you follow it up with Smallpox, you got the max value out of it. You're making them lose a life, discard a card, sacrifice their mana dork, sacrifice their land, and you're really far ahead at that point. You 3 for 2'd them, and not only that, like you're you're up 2 lands to 0 basically. It's just very, very easy to win from that point. Thoughtseize, another discard spell. Toxic Deluge, removal. Yahenni's Expertise, removal. They're both wraths. They're pretty good. Yahenni's Expertise is pretty sweet in this list because the deck has overall a very low mana curve. For enchantments, we have Better Blossom. I think this is another one of the best cards in the deck. opening Bitter Blossom into Braids is just very, very good. It's pay a life, sacrifice, like pay a life to feed Braids every turn. And then at a certain point, you can overwhelm them. Chains of Mephistopheles, I would not recommend picking up this card if you don't already have one, but it's pretty sweet. It's very, very good against all the blue decks in the format. If a player would draw a card, except the first one he or she draws in his or her draw step each turn, that player discards a card instead. If the player discards a card this way, he or she draws a card. If the player doesn't discard a card this way, he or she puts the top card of his or her library into his or her graveyard. The last clause is not very good, but mostly what this says is if an opponent would try to draw a card beyond their first, they have to discard a card in order to draw a card. So Brainstorm says discard 3 cards, draw 3 cards, put 2 cards back on the top of your library. That's insanely powerful. Ponder says look at the top 3, discard a card, draw a card. And then if they're not willing to do these things, they have to discard they have to, sorry, not discard, they have to mill cards off the top. Often that helps people, but mostly even if it is doing that, you're forcing them to not be able to use their card draw. They're less likely to be able to find answers to your position, and all of their expensive like card draw that's going to help them just gain a raw amount of cards just doesn't work anymore. They're not going to be able to gain a lot of cards from card draw. Contamination is just another pretty simple card that just locks many people out of the game. During your upkeep, sacrifice a creature, sacrifice Contamination. Whenever a land is tapped for mana, it produces black instead of its normal type and amount. So you can Bitter Blossom Contamination and just lock people out of the game for mana for 20-ish turns. With Bloodghast, as long as you're hitting your land drops, you have another way to feed it. Same with Nether Spirit, Nether Trader potentially, Ophiomancer, uh, Hangerback Walker, Grave Titan tokens, etc. You can just lock people out. As far as the mana base is concerned, it's pretty straightforward. This deck actually has a lot of colorless lands. I'm not positively sold that all of them should be in here, but right now we have Cabal Pit, pay a black, it deals you a damage, and then for Threshold, which is 7 or more cards in the graveyard, you can pay a black, sacrifice it, target creature gets -2/-2 until end of turn. So it's just a removal spell that's pretty sweet with Crucible. You can just play a land that is uh, a removal spell every single turn. Cavern lets you force through important spells. Human, I think, is like the best name in terms of what you're going to be able to force through, which is Ophiomancer, Braids, and Dark Confidant. Demon lets you push through Abyssal Persecutor, um, Desecration Demon. There's actually a fair amount of spirits between Nether Trader, Nether Spirit, and Bloodghast. And then beyond that, it's just kind of pick and choose. You got like Worm for Wormcoil Engine, Giant for Grave Titan. There's a Construct. I doubt you should be really naming Hangerback, but there are some corner cases where it could come up. Um, Command Beacon is nice because if you're basically playing Braids as a one-time effect where they sacrifice a permanent, sometimes once you cast her for 4 and then 6, beyond that sometimes it gets tough to cast her, and Command Beacon can help alleviate that. Um, it's also very sweet with Crucible that you just get to keep on playing it and keep playing 4 mana Braids. Drownyard Temple taps for a colorless, and for 3 you get to return Drownyard Temple from your graveyard to the battlefield tapped. It's an expensive way to make Braids unsymmetrical, but it does have that effect, even though it is expensive. Gaia Reach Sanitarium is nice for if you flood out or anything like that. You just get to loot. God's Eye is a like one-time use. You get to sacrifice it, then you get a 1/1, and then you can sacrifice that. So it feeds Braids twice, which is nice. Lake of the Dead is a really easy way to power out your very expensive cards. So it says if Lake of the Dead would enter the battlefield, sacrifice a swamp instead. If you do, put Lake of the Dead onto the battlefield. If you don't, put it into its owner's graveyard. Tap, add black mana. Uh, Tap, sacrifice a swamp, add black, 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 black. So you can play turn 2 Braids off of this. I think. Maybe not. You can accelerate out your very powerful cards is the point. Mishra's Factory and Mutavault are both creature lands. They're just gonna let you actually win the game at some point. They're nice with Crucible, just being able to play a threat over and over and over. Rishadan Port is some mana denial. Works well with Braids. You can force them to sacrifice, and then before their draw step, port down one of their lands or whatever. That's very good. 27 swamps. At the end of the day, this is a mono black deck. There could be an argument for playing the fetch lands in here. They're very good with Crucible, obviously, and as a result, good with Bloodghast or whatever. But the deck doesn't have a lot of built-in life gain. It does have a fair amount of effects that want it to pay life, so I just decided to, we've decided to not play fetch lands in the deck as a result. Tectonic Edge for dealing with important lands. Urborg, because we are playing a lot of colorless lands in the deck. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 colorless lands. Some amount of the time, it's going to help your opponent by fixing their mana. They'll always have swamps, for example, as long as they have lands, but it does allow you to have some freedom when playing colorless lands if you do have Urborg, because it just fixes your mana. And then we have Wasteland, which is just very good in this style of deck, and it's a free roll in monocolor decks for the most part anyways, so just again, you can like Wasteland lock non-basic decks out of the game with Crucible, just keep Wastelanding them over and over and over. So that's the deck list. It's pretty straightforward. Uh, Mono black Stax. If you like Stax style decks, I encourage you to give this a try. If you've never played it before, but you like mono black, you'll probably like this deck. Um, it's fairly cheap without like chains being, a $400 card. $700, not all that unreasonable for a complete 100 card deck. And you could trim some prices here and there, but uh, a lot of these cards that typically were very expensive, like Damnation, for example, Wasteland, Cavern of Souls, all these cards are down a fair amount from their normal prices before the Modern Masters reprint. So now's a good time to invest in the cards, even if you don't plan on necessarily playing this deck specifically. Uh, But yeah, this deck should have like a pretty good matchup against the mid-range decks and the control decks if you can resolve Braids. It could struggle against aggro because you don't have a lot of life gain in the deck, and uh, they're generally on a lot of cheaper spells, which allows them to play to the board more often. And I could see this deck struggling with Zergo because it can just kill Braids at the end step and such. But the deck should be pretty good against mid range and control. Give it a try. Thanks for watching.